So Scott said I could do my own introduction of myself. I was preaching down in Houston one time, and one of my former students was going to introduce me and says, "What do you want me to say about you?" And I said, "I don't care, just don't oversell." My rule of life is low expectations, few disappointments. So I didn't think he'd really do it, but he gets up there and he says, "Our speaker today is Randy Harris." He's pretty good. I've heard better. Okay, kind of get what you ask for, right? So my understanding of what I'm doing here is teaching class. I don't know what your understanding is. If you come tomorrow afternoon, I promise I'll preach a sermon. This is not a sermon, this is class. The difference in this and some classes is I won't be taking questions from you, although there will be moments when I will allow you to talk to the person beside you, and I'll give you something interesting to do. And my topic is basically spirituality in a secular world. And I'm largely going to be reflecting on a big, fat book by Charles Taylor called A Secular Age. It is 900 pages long, so I am doing you a favor. Although I would highly recommend that the ministers in the audience make the investment. But I'm going to give you the Harris condensed version. And I am going to be preoccupied with the question of what it means to be a faithful follower of Jesus Christ today. Because the best way to be a faithful follower of Jesus Christ 25 years or 50 years from now is to be faithful today. And what the next 25 or 50 years is going to look like in the world is utterly unpredictable. And you shouldn't trust anybody who claims to be able to tell you what that's going to be. Miroslav Volf says, in 50 years, there are two possibilities that would make religion irrelevant. One is Jesus would come again. That would make religion irrelevant. Number two, human beings will create some creature that is so much better than we are that we will become an annoyance to them and they will kill us. I refer to this as the Terminator possibility. Otherwise, no matter what technology does, religion is going to be significant because religion answers questions that science can't. Questions of meaning, questions of value, questions of purpose. So I'm going to stay out of the future. I'm going to stay in the present. I went to see my financial advisor recently. I got all my information together, and I went to see her, and I was proposing a couple of possible retirement dates. And she looked at one of those dates and says, "You got about a 75% chance of being successful." And I said, "What are you calculating my death age at?" And she said, 93. I said, 93, I'll take up smoking. There are things you can do to keep that from happening. When I get to 85, I'll go out for a hike and just keep hiking until I die. And all of a sudden, my odds go way up. Okay, so I'm going to stay out of the future. I'm going to stay in the present. All right, I'm going to give you a little something to do with the person beside you. It's a riddle. And if you've heard the riddle before, then don't spoil it. Just be a good listener, the person beside you. At the beginning of my career, which was a very long time ago now, when I would talk to prospective student ministers who always had questions and concerns about working with elders, I would always say, there is one question that you have to ask about your elders, and it is the single most important question in determining how you work with them. Now, here's the rest of the riddle. I no longer tell my students this. What do you think the thing I said they should ask about their elders is? You can talk to the person beside you and see if you have a thought on that. Okay, time is up. Here's the question. See if anybody got it right. I said the single most important question that you could ask that I no longer ask because it's now irrelevant is this. Did they live through the Great Depression? Because that experience would have more impact on their thinking than any other single thing. And for the most part, they weren't aware of it. And so you have this young whippersnapper preacher come in, and he's got all these great plans, and his elders are sort of dragging their feet, and he thinks they're unfaithful when what they really are is cautious. Because they've seen what happens when you get in debt and lose everything. That is an example of what Charles Taylor calls a social imaginary. It is the way we think even without knowing we're thinking that way. It's about the way we see the world. And part of my point is going to be today that the way people actually see the world and the way they answer questions when you ask about it are not the same thing. Everybody with me here? So when you give people a quiz and ask them whether they believe in God, high percentages of them will say yes, but in terms of their social imaginary, how they actually do the world, God has little or nothing to do with it. You will also have people, by the way, who claim to be atheists who do all sorts of spiritual things. It's what they're doing when they're not thinking about it, when you're not looking at it. Okay, that was my first introduction. Here's my second introduction. By the way, what we're getting this morning are like 3 or 4 introductions. Tomorrow there might be a speech. Okay, how's that? One of the great things about coming to summer celebration is I have all these people here who actually know their Bible, which is just a great pleasure to me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through some bits of the Old Testament very quickly because most of you are going to be quite familiar with what I'm doing. And you'll be able to follow the sort of line that I'm doing here, and then we'll see if there's a point. There are a series of at least 3, probably 4, notable crises in the Old Testament. There are things that happen that so transform the world that the people have to completely rethink their lives. In a recent book on church leadership that apparently everybody read before I did, Todd Bosinger uses the example of Lewis and Clark when they're exploring the American West, looking for that river route from coast to coast, and then they find out there is no Northwest Passage. What there are is the Rocky Mountains. And he names his book Canoeing the Mountains, because they brought canoes, but what they've got is mountains. Now they're off the map. And there are several times in the Old Testament when that happens. The reason I said 3, maybe 4, if you want to count the first one is when the people of Israel leave Egyptian bondage and go to the wilderness. Because all the rules they had learned about life up till then, more or less, didn't apply afterwards. It's a drastic change. But I'm not going to dwell on that one. I want to hit the other 3. The second one is when they settle in the Promised Land. And this is a crisis because now a question is being raised that Israel has never had to answer before. The most important question in the world is, can their God, Yahweh, make the crops grow? And they don't know the answer to that because he's never had to before. And in fact, they're a little unsure about it. And there is this God waiting in this territory, or a group of gods that we call Baal. And they're gods of the storm, god of the land. They're basically fertility gods. And they're not so far off the map that they're going to quit worshiping Yahweh, but they tend to worship one of these gods too to sort of hedge their bets. You worship Yahweh because he's great in a battle, and you worship Baal to make the crops grow. And it's a crisis. They don't know yet how to be an agricultural people that trust God. Second big crisis. As they settle into the land, they develop some enemies around. And in fact, they don't really have any internal structure to make society work. And so we go through this period that we read about in the book of Judges, every 7th grade boy's favorite book of the Bible, where lots of blood flowing and violence and battles. And the conclusion of the book of Judges is this: everyone did what was right in their own eyes. There was no king in Israel. And so they're in need of some structure to create some stability in society, but appointing a king is actually quite a problem because Israel already has a king. His name is Yahweh. And the question is, can Israel have a king and still have Yahweh as their king? Now, I don't know how much you remember about that story, but let me just say this: it doesn't go great. It gets off to a decent start. Saul's an impressive guy. It's just unfortunate he's wacko. That's kind of the technical term for it. He doesn't appear to be mentally ill at the beginning, but he clearly is by the end. I don't know whether it's his spiritual failures that lead to his psychological collapse or the other way around. I'm not going to try to sort that out. David is a little bit of a mixed bag. And Solomon introduces widespread idolatry into Israel. Solomon marries everybody. And every time he marries a foreign wife, he introduces a foreign god into Israel. And so trying to sort out how do you be the people of God when you have a king is actually a significant crisis in Israel. But those do not nearly compare with the last one, the final great crisis in the Hebrew Bible, when the people are taken into exile. This raises questions about whether they have connected themselves to the wrong God. After all, do you want to worship a God who cannot protect his own land, or his own house. You can actually see this getting played out. Let me just read you one of the Exile Psalms, 137, and I'm going to emphasize a piece of it not everybody does. By the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. There on the poplars we hung our harps. For there our captors asked us for songs. Our tormentors demanded songs of joy. They said, "Sing us one of the songs of Zion." How can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a foreign land? That's the question. How can you worship a God who let you down? Well, we could go to the next crisis, and that is when the people come back, but it's not like the good old days, but you've got the point. Things happen sometimes that are such drastic events that it requires us to think all over again about what it means to be a believer in God, or in our case, a follower of Jesus Christ in the situation in which we find ourselves. Now, back to Charles Taylor for a moment. Charles Taylor is basically in his 900 pages trying to explain how we got from point A to point B. For point A, I'm just going to pick a year randomly. It's not exact, but it'll make the point. The year I'm going to pick is 1500. In 1500, in the Western world, unbelief wasn't really much of a thing. Virtually everyone in the Western world was a believer. Now, they disagreed about exactly what you should believe. I just got through reading a really long book about Erasmus and Luther, and it just made me feel good about today, because today when we have theological disagreements, somebody leaves church. Back then, they killed you. And the only ones who didn't kill the other people was because they didn't have the power to. But the disagreements were about different areas of doctrine. The disagreements weren't about whether you believe in Jesus Christ or not. And in fact, in the Western world, at least up to the year 1500, it was what Taylor describes as an enchanted world. It's not like there were never any unbelievers, but for the most part, people were believers, and the question is not, is there a God? The question is, of all the possible gods, which one is really God? It was about picking the right God, not whether there was one or not. And God was responsible for the weather. God was responsible for health and disease. God was responsible for plentiful or bad harvests. The world revolved around their fundamental convictions about God. But over the last 500 years, and particularly in the last 100 years, things have changed somewhat. Now, I'm going to give you a test here to see if you are secular or not. And by the way, I want everybody to make a high grade, so the answer is yes. There's a sense in which we're all very secular or worldly. Okay, here's the quiz to find out whether you're secular or not. What do you do when you have a plumbing problem? Okay. Those of you who are wise, call a plumber. Those of you who are foolish, get a wrench. and then you call a plumber. What do you do when you get sick? Call the doctor. And it never occurred to you, probably, that what you really needed to do was to pray over your pipes. Although I admit I've done that. Didn't work. But that seemed less expensive than the plumber. And when I'm sick, I'm more inclined to make an appointment with my doctor than I am with my preacher, who's a nice guy, but not great with the common cold. And when I'm hungry, I go to my refrigerator. I look in, and then I go to a restaurant. I don't think very much about where that food comes from. In fact, if I want to, unless I'm doing something like this, I can get through my whole day without ever really having to think about God. And so can you. We've created a world in which that sort of direct dependence is not there. And in that sense, we're all secular. Now, let me give you another sense. I thought about doing this morning, but decided I didn't want to take the time to do it. If you're really interested, we'll do it tomorrow. In my freshman Bible majors class, I showed them a video clip of an exorcism, a real one. The girl is actively psychotic, different voices, different personalities. It's really quite frightening. And they have a priest come in and do the prayers of exorcism. She's been through all sorts of drug treatments and psychotherapy, and they do the exorcism, and she appears to have gotten quite better. And then I asked my students the simple question, okay, do you believe she was demon-possessed? Or do you believe that her problems were psychological? And I have them vote. And in the strange world in which we live, the vote's pretty close. But more of my students vote that she's got psychological problems than vote for she's demon-possessed. Now, that's interesting because I show it to my friends from the two-thirds world, and they say, well, of course she's demon-possessed. Of course she's demon-possessed. What she needs is prayer and the casting out of the demon, because in the world in which they live, they do not default to the secular explanation. Now, many of us are secular, most of us are secular, in this second sense too. Our first reaction is to default to the secular explanation. We may come back to a spiritual explanation, but our social imaginary is to see in our world mental illness, not demon possession. Most of us are like that. But it's the third version of secular that I'm most interested in. And that's the form of secularity that doesn't just say, when I need plumbing help, I call a plumber. And that doesn't just say, okay, I'm more likely to see mental illness than I am demon possession. It's the kind of secularity that says there is nothing other than this world. Taylor describes this as the immanentist frame, that there is nothing transcendent, There's nothing outside this world, and any attempt to make explanations outside this world are out of bounds. That kind of secular. Now, I appreciate your patience. You're doing great. So Taylor argues that the big difference between 2000 and 1500 is in 1500, the default social imaginary is to believe in God. And in 2000, the default social imaginary is not. And that's the world in which we live. Now, one other concept from Taylor. He uses the term cross-pressured to explain our situation. And I want to spend just a few minutes thinking this through. I want to think about two different kinds of people. Okay, this is the part where you got to work harder. Okay. All right. One person believes in God, but for them, unbelief is always a possibility. Everybody with me here? And they believe in God, but they have lots of friends who don't. And they have questions. They have lots of questions. Their questions began in about third grade with dinosaurs, which are a significant theological problem. That God would create something as cool as a dinosaur and then kill it with a meteor before human beings showed up for millions and millions of years? That's a theological problem. I don't know if they really learned that in third grade. It might be second. I don't know. Doesn't go away. And there are all these questions that arise that make me think, okay, maybe I don't have this right. Maybe if the earth is millions of years old, how do I account for that? And a worldwide flood, how do I account for that? And the genocides of the Old Testament, how do I account for that? And I just read an article, an interview in the New York Times where the president of Union Seminary is kind of denying the resurrection and the virgin birth. She's at a seminary. And so Christians are cross-pressured. They believe, but unbelief is all around them. Well, let me talk about a second group of people. They are unbelievers, but they are what Charles Taylor calls haunted by transcendence. They're unbelievers, but belief is often sort of knocking at the door. These are the unbelievers who go and listen to a Beethoven symphony and say, man, that music sounds like it came straight out of heaven. Really? Or they're the people who go hiking in the Rocky Mountains and say, this is just beyond imagination. Really? Or more often, you're people who are sitting home at night after they've had a little something to drink, wondering, is this it? Is this all there is? The late David Foster Wallace's speech, This Is Water, graduation speech he gave relatively shortly before he killed himself, has been viewed millions and millions of times. I strongly recommend you go to YouTube. If you haven't looked at it, look at it. Well, You can go ahead and look at it now if you want to be rude, but you could. It's gut-wrenching. Wallace is an unbeliever. He's the prototypical unbeliever who is haunted by transcendence. He desperately wants to believe in a meaning and significance in the world, and he's urging these college graduates to find that, but he just can't get to believe. There's two different kinds of people: the believer who has unbelief all around them and for whom it's a possibility, and the unbeliever who's haunted by transcendence. Those aren't the only two kinds of people in the world, right? Okay, two more kinds of people. There's the other kind of person, the believer, who never has a question about unbelief. I had an aunt like this who never had a single significant theological thought in her life. And she was a most excellent Christian. She was kind. She was a believer. She epitomized what I think Jesus would look like if he were in the world and he were my aunt. My family didn't really believe in like comic books, but I loved comic books. They also didn't believe in pinball machines, and I have one in my living room now. Man, get old enough, you can do what you want to. I also have a bludgeoning collection of graphic novels. They're not comic books anymore. And she gave me a couple of comic books she thought my parents would approve of. I think one of them was The Big Bad Wolf, but the word golly or gee was in there, and she marked it out in pen. Do you admire that kind of commitment or what? I mean, she was fantastic. She didn't ever really believe that human beings had been on the moon. She thought that was phony. I couldn't really explain to her that The Exorcist was a movie because she was intent that somebody had to prove that didn't happen. I said, well, anyway. And there are those kind of people in the world. Never a question, never a doubt. Nothing kind of interrupts their believing world. The word that is usually applied to this, somewhat uncharitably in my estimation, is the word fundamentalist. Not all the people in the category I've just described, I think, would describe themselves as fundamentalists, but these are people whose beliefs are unmoved by things like dinosaurs. Now, fourth category of person. There's another person on the other end that I'm going to describe as an atheist fundamentalist. That is, they are so committed to their unbelief that they won't consider any evidence to the contrary. Most of the new atheists who've done writing in the last few years would go in the category of what I would call atheist fundamentalist. And I'll just tell you intellectually, I find this stuff really sloppy, really weak. They take the worst possible presentation of Christianity and then think that proves Christianity isn't true. And they are as without doubt as the religious fundamentalist is. And I don't spend lots of time having conversations with atheist fundamentalists because they don't go anywhere. They just don't go anywhere. I don't spend lots of time having conversations with religious Christian fundamentalists either because I don't want to mess them up. Be happy. I spend a lot of time with those two other categories. In fact, I've given my life to it. So very, very carefully disguising everything I need to. I was speaking in a state far from here, and in the lobby of the hotel where we were staying, I ran into an ex-student, and it didn't. The synapses didn't connect immediately because he didn't live there either. So I was there for one reason. He was visiting there for another convention, which I won't tell you, that may say more than I want it to. And we run into each other in the lobby. So we decided to eat breakfast. And this is somebody who was one of our religion majors. And he's an unbeliever now. And in our conversation, this is the piece that haunts me. He looks me in the eye and he says, Randy, nobody tried harder to make this work than I did. There's nobody who wants to believe more than I do. And it made me think back. I could think back several years before when he was sitting in his driveway and we were on the phone together. And I knew he was in distress and trying to work it out, and I'm trying to help him work it out. And this is before he goes into the house to greet his wife, who's at a different place than he is, and that's a whole new level of stress when he's moving towards unbelief. What's that going to do to the life they have together? And I have no reason not to believe him about that. That he was trying hard, but in a secular world, he couldn't find a way to make it work. So I work in Christian education, and I work with a lot of young people whose parents are in the category of those who've never had a question or doubt. Their sons and daughters, however, have lots of questions and doubts. And I'm trying to figure out, how do I do the best by these sons and daughters and grandsons and granddaughters that people love more than they love life itself? How do I do right by them? And how do I do right by the God who is in Christ reconciling the world to himself? How does faith get formed in a cross-pressured world? Knowing it's not always going to turn out the way I want it to. Now, if you think that's a question worth thinking about, come back tomorrow and we'll think about it. But I want to tell you, we're canoeing the mountains here. We're off the map. We're no longer in the world where default belief is the setting. And maybe it's highly appropriate that I'm doing this when at a lecture where the theme is the Holy Spirit, because if there's not a whole lot of God in this, it's probably isn't going to go very well. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and give you peace. To him who is able to keep you from falling and to present you before his glorious presence without fault and with great joy. Through the Lord Jesus Christ be glory and dominion, power and authority before all ages, now and forevermore, world without end. Amen.